Summer 1945, Potsdam, Germany. A young U.S. President Harry Truman entered the conference hall, carrying a heavy briefcase inside it, the promises and worries left by Roosevelt, and the newborn weight of the atomic age. Across the table sat the iron-faced Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. They shook hands for the cameras, smiled for protocol, yet behind those smiles, their minds were clicking on different abacuses. Truman's most urgent mission was to restore order. Europe lay in ruins. Asia was trembling on the verge of Japan's collapse. Stalin demanded the rewards of victory: territory, influence, security. Truman wanted new rules markets, recovery, alliances. They looked at the same map but drew different lines, and those lines would later harden into the fragile crack we now call the Korean Armistice Line. No one then knew the date of the next war, but its seeds were sown. While the Iron Curtain descended over Europe, two calendars began to tick in East Asia, one drawn by America, centered on Japan's recovery, the other by the Soviet Union and China, measured in revolutions. Korea stood trapped between those calendars, caught between the joy of liberation and the chaos of division. Under U.S. military rule in the South and Soviet control in the North, two administrations began writing their own versions of tomorrow. Those who lived through it still remember the heavy tone of the radio announcers. The world speaks of peace, yet the boots remain on. Such was the air of the time. The U.S. believed the war was over. Stalin believed it had merely changed form. In Truman's notebook were plans for European recovery and Asian strategy. In Stalin's margins were written buffer zones, friendly regimes, and one crucial word: time. Time was his weapon. He could wait. At Potsdam, Stalin clearly stated his price for joining the war against Japan, southern Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and regional influence. Truman sidestepped, insisting on a framework of stability. Both men knew each other's strengths: America's industry in dollars versus the Soviet Army's sacrifice in numbers. Between their polite sentences, suspicion quietly grew. Neither could know that their handshake that day would echo 5 years later. As gunfire along the 38th parallel, Korea was still a small peninsula on the map. Yet as America looked through Japan and the Soviet Union through China, each began to see Korea differently. To the U.S., a strategic seawall guarding the Pacific balance. To Moscow, a shield for the northern frontier and the revolution beyond. Two calculations, opposite directions, brick by brick, the wall of division rose. History calls that handshake the end of war. In truth, it was the beginning of the Cold War. The hall at Potsdam was quiet, but the words on paper were cold. Few sensed that the chill would ignite into the gunfire of June 1950. Yet the Korean night sky was already trembling. Wars begin not with bullets, but with calculations. And those calculations always change men and maps. From that moment on, Korea's clock was tied to the world's, its hands waiting for someone else to decide the hour. Returning from Potsdam, Truman sought to build organizations of peace: the United Nations, Reconstruction Aid, New Alliances. Their names sounded benevolent, but beneath each lay a balance of power. When the Marshall Plan lifted Europe, Stalin clenched Eastern Europe tighter. Every alliance created its opposite. North and South Korea became the test field of that law. The North received the Soviet manual, the South adopted the American one. Two textbooks in one classroom, the blackboard split in half. Stalin was in no hurry. For him, war was simply politics by other means. Kim Il-sung was different, young, impatient. He feared that the shouts of liberation would fade before his revolution was complete. If the South built an army and a government, the North's momentum would vanish. He argued for today. Stalin warned of tomorrow. But as the global standoff deepened, Stalin's notes gained a new line: short, decisive, minimal cost. Meanwhile, Truman anchored his strategy on Japan. A rebuilt Japan would be the keel of America's Pacific order, and Korea its breakwater. Strategists in Washington unfolded maps and marked the peninsula with a tiny star. If this point falls, the whole Pacific shakes. In Seoul, daily life went on. Markets reopened. Children played along the rice paddies. Elderly Koreans still recall that uneasy calm. We thought the war was over, but the uniforms stayed too long. The guns were silent, but other noises filled the air: ideology, censorship, and fear. Stalin no longer viewed Korea as a laboratory, but as a chessboard. The pieces would move, yet the king must remain safe. Kim Il-sung wanted a gamble. Stalin asked, how will America react? Would the U.S. intervene from the sea? What would the United Nations write? How far had Japan recovered? As those answers tilted in one direction, Stalin's gaze hardened. If it can be done swiftly, why not? From that moment, the North's war plan had a calendar. Seoul in 3 days, the South in 1 month. A blitz speed and confusion in red pencil on the map. Strike before diplomacy could even finish a sentence. Wars are often won by those who steal the other side's time. Telegrams are slow, tanks are fast. Truman, too, was changing. He had seen the Soviet pattern in Europe and recognized it in Asia. If Japan's sea lanes were to stay open, the southern half of Korea could not fall. That logic shaped his decision on June 27, 1950, when he ordered troops before Congress could even debate it. It was not merely ideology, it was arteries, trade routes, alliances, trust. He was defending the lifelines of a system. By 1950, summer approached, and with it, the smell of war. To ordinary civilians, life still looked normal. But along the border, the night lights were moving. Reports grew shorter, orders firmer. And then one dawn, gunfire woke the peninsula. History would call it the Korean War, 625 War. But that day was no accident, it was the meeting point of the two calendars born at Potsdam. Once again, the Korean people paid the bill for history's arithmetic. Hands that once cooked rice now beat the war drum. Radio music turned into the shrill of whistles. And through that narrow gap of everyday life, war quietly stepped in. Returning from Potsdam, Truman set out to build what he called organizations of peace. The United Nations, foreign aid programs, and new alliances sounded noble, yet each carried the shadow of power. When the Marshall Plan revived Europe, Stalin tightened his grip on the East. Every alliance bred its mirror image. The divided Korean peninsula became the testing ground of that rule. The North followed the Soviet textbook. The South learned from the American manual. 2 lessons in one classroom and the blackboard cracked in half. Stalin never rushed. He treated war as another tool of politics. But Kim Il-sung was young and impatient. He feared the cheers of liberation would fade before his revolution took root. Once the South built an army and a stable government, the North's momentum might vanish. Kim pressed for action. Stalin measured reaction. Yet as U.S. Soviet confrontation hardened worldwide, Stalin's own notes gained a new line. Short war. Decisive result. Minimal cost. Meanwhile, Truman rebuilt Japan as the anchor of American order in Asia. A prosperous Japan would stabilize. The Pacific and Korea would serve as its breakwater. Strategists in Washington unfolded. Maps and marked a small star on the peninsula. If this point collapses, the entire Pacific trembles. On the ground, Koreans knew little of those maps. Markets reopened. Children chased each other along the paddies. Elders still recall that uneasy calm. We thought the war was over, but the uniforms stayed too long. The guns had fallen silent, but ideology and fear filled the air. By now, Stalin no longer saw Korea as a laboratory, but as a chessboard. The pieces could move, but the king must remain safe. Kim demanded a strike. Stalin asked, how will America respond? Would the U.S. cross the sea? What would the U.N. declare? How strong had Japan become again? As those answers pointed toward hesitation, Stalin's gaze hardened. If it can be done swiftly, why not? From that moment, the North's war plan gained a calendar. 3 days to Seoul, 1 month for the South. Speed and confusion, the red words drawn across the map. Wars are often won by those who steal the enemy's time. Telegrams move slowly, tanks do not. That was the gap they meant to exploit. Part 2. The timetable of invasion. Lower part. Truman, too, was changing. He had watched the Soviet pattern in Europe and recognized it in Asia. If Japan's sea lanes were to remain open, the southern half of Korea must not fall. That logic would guide his swift decision on June 27, 1950, a presidential order before Congress even finished its debate. It was not grand ideology alone, but the defense of arteries, trade routes, and trust. He was guarding the bloodstream of a system. By 1950, the peninsula waited in breathless tension. Summer fields turned green and the scent of rice mixed with the smell of gasoline. To civilians, life felt normal, yet along the border, the nights were restless. Lights moved through the hills, reports grew shorter, orders more urgent. Each dawn carried the weight of something approaching. North Korean officers rehearsed on sand tables under dim lamps. Lines of miniature tanks crossed miniature bridges. Their timetable was precise, almost mechanical. Day 1 Seoul, Day 10 Daejeon, Day 30 Busan. They believed confusion itself would be their strongest weapon. If the world hesitated, they could finish before a single resolution was passed. Across the CUS, analysts sensed the tremor but could not predict the hour. Memoranda piled up with cautious phrases, "no imminent threat." Yet on the ground, Korean farmers saw something else. Trains moving at night, new uniforms in the villages, and the strange silence that precedes thunder. Then came that dawn. Artillery lit the horizon and telegraph lines went dead. Within hours, radio announcers shouted, "This is war! North Korean forces have crossed the 38th parallel." The peninsula awoke to the echo of its own division. History would name it the Korean War. But it was no accident of dawn. It was the meeting point of two calendars, one written in Washington, the other in Moscow. The line that began at Potsdam now roared with fire. Hands that once cooked rice beat the war drum. Music on the radio turned into the shrill of air raid sirens, and through the small cracks of ordinary life, war quietly stepped inside.